I must admit, I was excited to play Final Fantasy Origins Stranger of Paradise. This is a third-person action RPG made by Team Ninja, and feels like the spiritual successor to their Nioh series. Released on the 18th of March 2022, I got my hands on this title on launch day and was able to ascertain for myself what it meant when one of my all-time favourite progression and combat loops in recent gaming combined with my all-time favourite franchise story-wise. The results were enigmatic and chaotic in equal measure, with the end result being utterly disappointing at best. Stranger of Paradise takes on a darker tone than the majority of Final Fantasy games. Even in the opening cutscene, there's unusually bleak and bloody scenes of destruction. The game quickly cuts to the tutorial battle and introduces you to Jack, the protagonist. Jack's not really your generic Final Fantasy protagonist, as he looks more mature and world-weary than the wide-eyed teens you usually play as. His veteran presence does help set the tone. This isn't a walk in the park. It's clear that by design this was intended to be a more difficult experience than your average Final Fantasy game, and that mostly comes through in the combat. Jack and his companions are holders of magic crystals, and must go on a journey to collect elemental crystals and defeat the Chaos threat, which no one seems to know if it's existential or a physical manifestation. What is clear is that regardless, Jack wants to punch it in the face, badly, and for the life of me, I spent most of this game with absolutely no idea why. Even at its absolute best, this story does not score a passing grade by any metric. These characters are undeveloped. They go from little strangers to fist-bumping besties in a single cutscene. Their subsequent development is done through quipping in the field and fanboying over Jack's ability to hit things. The plot's driving force is anchored on Jack's desire to dropkick Chaos, and everyone else is here by a process of along for the ride. Without much in the way of their own motivations, the actual words being spoken here leave me the impression that no consideration was taken to build a true narrative or indeed develop these characters. This feels more like a Cliff Notes version of a story. There are giant leaps between what happens in one scene to the next, and no real way for a player to piece them together other than going into the menus and reading some of the other text. Poor writing aside, the voice acting here is not terrible. Todd Haberkorn, who plays Natsu Dragneel in the Fairy Tail anime, is perhaps the best character, and might be the most developed of all these characters, despite not being the protagonist or a member of the main party. I honestly don't know if something had been lost in translation, but the plot here seems to leap forward so quickly and in such a disjointed way that I'm surprised anyone can keep up with it. Yet, surprisingly, the story's final acts come together quite well. These characters are still weak and underdeveloped, but it's here you see what the game was trying to do. As a long-time Final Fantasy fan, I appreciate the effort, even if the results are catastrophic. In terms of actual gameplay, this shares some serious traits with Nioh. You have a world map, from which you select levels. You can replay these at any point for extra loot, and each one is like a mini dungeon. As you explore, you collect loot, do some light puzzle solving, and fight monsters. These aren't a linear corridor, but are closer to that than the open world I just spent 90 hours of the previous week exploring in Elden Ring. As levels got bigger towards the end of the game, they have more twists and turns and branching paths, but each one has a definitive start and finish, kind of like a chapter in Devil May Cry. Visually speaking, these do have a fair bit of variety, and have palettes and designs that pull from previous Final Fantasy titles. These locations are not what I'd call iconic though. This isn't like World of Final Fantasy, where you see the chibi versions of places you know and love. These areas seem to be inspired by, rather than attempts to recreate. There's a pirate-themed level early on that shares a lot of design elements with Sastasha, a dungeon in Final Fantasy XIV. Others later on share the same industrial theme as the Mako reactor in Final Fantasy VII, or the snowy mountain upon which Kamari lives in Final Fantasy X. As you progress through these levels, you find orbs that are checkpoints. You amass loot, equipment, and the likes, which you use to improve your character. This loot follows the usual factors, rarity and level, with level scaling roughly with story progression, and rarity being based on luck and roll numbers, which can be further affected by difficulty settings. This follows the Nioh loot system and the throwing of loot at you at an obscene pace. Each piece of gear features different random effects, which can be buffed at a smithy. I'll touch on that a bit more later, but you certainly aren't going to be without new equipment to choose from as you progress. You have a limited supply of potions in the field and an MP bar that recharges, but the main difference between this and your average Souls-like experience, which clearly inspired some of the traits in this game, is the lack of a key or stamina meter. Praise the sun, you can dodge spam until your thumb falls off. That's not to say Stranger of Paradise isn't difficult. as it clearly had some ambition to be hard in the same way a traditional Massacre game would be. But thanks to the extra features it adds, it couldn't follow the traditional formula that Team Ninja's own Nioh did. The first and most noticeable difference is that you have two companions running around with you at all times. These feel and behave a lot like having Tifa and Barret with you in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and a large portion of the menu aesthetic is borrowed from that game too. This means there are two extra characters on screen to beat up your foes, and that means a lot of encounters feature multiple enemies and are scaled to work with the extra bodies. It also means that you have at least two other party members to equip when it comes to gear and weapons, so you're putting to use a lot of the gear that drops for you, even more so when your bench of reserve characters expands some. This does leave combat feeling a bit frantic at times, and this is quite technical in a way that feels a lot like Devil May Cry, as you have several jobs or roles to choose from and a handful of different weapons. There are certainly enough different playstyles that there will be one you like. Some of these jobs are just extensions of previous jobs, more advanced roles that are direct upgrades on previous ones. You aren't going to be lacking for options and versatility, but for a fun experience, you need to have some self-awareness of where your skill lies. You can change the difficulty between story, action, and hard, with chaos unlocking at the endgame. Story difficulty also has an even easier mode called casual, which feels like the antithesis of what this game ought to be. Without the challenge involved here, I'd be struggling to find anything at all to praise. In terms of PS5 specific features, there is a little bit of haptic trigger feedback. This is very minimal, more like a controlled vibration during cutscenes where a room shakes or it feels like an earthquake's occurring. I didn't particularly mind this, as you're really tied to your right hand shoulder buttons for the majority of your actions, and this does mean that a lot of the controls end up being contextual. This is a significantly weaker design aspect for a game like this, where you need to have really good, really concise, perfect control over your character to be able to survive in combat. Too much dependence was placed here upon the R1 and R2 buttons, and the controls get really janky when you're trying to cast a spell with the mage class. I also didn't like that the game's dedicated contextual button prompt is the touchpad. I instinctively wanted to press triangle for a lot of these interactions, but that button is reserved for quickly switching between jobs. One new addition I do really like is the steal mechanic, essentially a perfect parry that comes at the cost of your own break gauge and can be used to absorb certain attacks that enemies throw at you. Successful timing restores MP and can even increase the maximum MP you have. If an enemy uses a specific attack on you, you can also steal that ability to throw it back in their face. Take this one for example. A bomb throws a fireball at me, but I time my soul ability and negate the damage. I restore MP and gain 3 uses of the fireball spell. I can turn these back on the host and force it to eat that fire and trigger a self-destruct. Depending on the difficulty you choose to play on, this can either be a fun little power trip or a baked-in necessity to break and kill some of the game's tougher enemies. The break gauge is a way to let Jack execute enemies regardless of health. If you've played Godfall, this is very similar to their posture damage mechanic. Managing MP and the break gauge are what you need to do here instead of managing ki or stamina. Overall, gameplay strikes a weird symbiosis between RPG mechanics and combat. The necessary skills and stats for playing each job, to the best of your ability, are locked behind the affinity stat, which appears on gear and in skill trees. This unlocks passive traits as it increases up to a cap of 400%. These job trees are mostly the usual passive buffs and active abilities, but did present another avenue for progression. Meaningful progression is another topic entirely. At no point during playing Stranger of Paradise did any job or role feel deep enough or complex enough that I felt good playing it. I spent over 90 hours in Nioh 2. Here, you're not mastering any single role to the same degree, because the options just aren't there. You're literally a jack of all trades and a master of none of them, and that's not really a way to play that feels fun. I want to briefly touch on this game's approach to loot and the endgame, as it's going to be a real dividing point for those of you who can overlook the game's story deficiencies and who do want to play it. As you progress through, you acquire new loot, and due to the rate at which you acquire it, you're constantly gaining new equipment. This represents your relative power, as there's no character levels to speak of. You are what you wear. The issue is that you never have any attachment to your gear because you're going to find something better before the next checkpoint. As such, you're constantly discarding pieces, and nothing you loot feels special as a result. This is because the progression throughout is just a steady line on the incline, and until you reach level 300, which is the endgame's endgame, there's nothing really that's worth hanging on to or looking forward to. No loot feels special in a game that's part looter. This is a massive mistake. There's perhaps an argument to be said when you look at all the loot you get. Well, it's because you've got more than 20 classes to gear for. But that's actually quite far from the truth. That sentiment would only apply at the end of the game, when you're holding level 300 items. It's only at that point do you truly gain any value in having individual sets for each job, as there's a lot of overlap in what stats you need on your way up there. In terms of graphics and performance, this was not an example anyone should look to. Graphically, this is a PlayStation 4 game, with some elements of the world sinking a generation further, and looking like the top-end PS3 games. Jack and his friends are all detailed enough as character models, but facial animations are practically lacking entirely. The level design is borrowed but diversive, and most of the background characters did not really need to be in the game at all, and serve no meaningful function other than looking atrocious. This is just not a very good looking game, and outside the plethora of armor, weapons and silly hats for Jack and Co to wear, not a lot of the design here stands out above the rest. These elements certainly fit within the game and Final Fantasy lore, but even iconic weapons like the Lionheart don't feel special because you'll be acquiring another, better one very quickly. As a final note on performance, this game did perform poorly at times, with noticeable stutters and huge frame drops when the particle effects got busy on screen. But I did expect it to run flawlessly and was very disappointed. Final Fantasy Origins Stranger of Paradise is unusual. It's not quite like any of the games it spawned from, at least not in a way that makes it easy to recommend. This story is just not good. It lacks the usual development that keeps a plot in a Final Fantasy game heading in the right direction. The pacing is set to light speed, and there are gaping plot holes that don't always get filled in, at least not to my satisfaction. Most of the important story connectors are told via plain text on loading screens, which in itself is a massive issue. This is the PS5 we're talking about. There should be a reasonable expectation that no loading screen lasts long enough to need filler text. The necessary structure of a Final Fantasy title is here, and that alone makes the story better than it would have otherwise been. Yet ultimately, this is little more than a lifeless husk that barely seems to be aware of the rich, story-driven legacy that the Final Fantasy series was built on. This narrative is also surprisingly short, taking around 20 hours of gameplay, and that's if you fail a couple of times. The combat and progression mechanics are really what hold this title together, but the question I'm left asking is, was any of this necessary? What we've got here feels like a shallow imitation of the systems that were in Neo 2, with most of the complexity and build creation removed in favour of trying to squeeze it into a Final Fantasy lore. The gear and upgrade systems have been stripped down to a bare bones version of that one too, and the way weapons behave here never reaches the same level of technicality and finesse that we've seen before from Team Ninja. As a weird side note, this is still likely to be Square's best multiplayer offering from their March 2022 catalogue, as Babylon's Fall and Chocobo GP were both disasters in their own right. Moment-to-moment gameplay at least functions in Stranger of Paradise, and I can see a few hours here with some friends, killing fiends being at least appealing. Despite being a huge Final Fantasy fan, it's clear that what's been added here to allow for marginal narrative improvements has come at too high a cost. The progression mechanics have been simplified, each facet of combat has been made shallower in exchange for enhanced diversity, and you have no real role in directing your companions. Instead, you're left with two D-pad buttons that basically tell your allies to try harder, with no more finesse than Jack's stunted dialogue. At least this title isn't overflowing with microtransactions. Do I think Stranger of Paradise is bad? No. Do I think it has bad elements and baffling design choices? Absolutely. Final Fantasy Origins Stranger of Paradise has enough unique elements that I don't begrudge its existence, but most of the game made me frustrated and angry as a fan. The best parts of this game are all done better and in more depth in other Team Ninja games, and the addition of the Final Fantasy name does not justify that shallowness. I would not recommend this game unless you are a compulsive Final Fantasy fan who will buy pretty much anything the franchise releases. I'm guilty as charged, but my recommendation to everyone else is to just buy Neo 2. The systems here that are good are all taken from that game, and it's a much better example of how to do a job and class system alongside RPG loot mechanics that feel deep and meaningful.